Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kirishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, la'asok b'divrei Torah, la'asok b'divrei Torah, la'asok b'divrei Torah, la'asok b'divrei Torah, la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, we're back at class. Again, as always, put some charity in your tzedakah box. You know, we've been doing this for a while. Take the charity out. Give it to someone on the street. Give it to any of the wonderful nonprofits that provide food for the homeless. Do not give it to the temple. That's not what it's for. Okay? Temples should give charity too, and we do. And each of us, for our study, should give charity to something else, some other organization that we believe in, food care project, whatever it may be. Okay, so last week we talked about that period, that Gaonic period, where the destruction of the temple had happened, and then we had the Gaon, Sadi Gaon, High Gaon, etc., who composed the prayer book, the Siddur. We talked about the reverse engineering of the four-letter name of God being the skeleton key that opens up everything in Judaism. It helps us understand, if you want to know why a service works the way it works or how it can work, that Yud, Hey, Vav, and Hey works. Well, now we're going to start talking about, as we get into the 10th century, the Siddur has been kind of codified. It's remained unchanged even till now, pretty much. And what's going to happen in the Jewish world? Now, let's just recap for a minute. The Jews have gone, they've dispersed in the diaspora. They've left Israel. They've gone all over the world. And we really have three groups, two groups, and one is a subsect. The first is Ashkenazi. That is up in Eastern Europe and Russia, Poland, Germany, that part of the world. You have the Sephardim. The Sephardim, Sephard means Spain in Hebrew. You have the Sephardic Jews that are in Spain, Morocco, Portugal, France to an extent, Italy to an extent, the Sephardic Jews. And the Mizrahi, which are a subsect, they're considered today part of Sephardic, but they're actually a little different, which are the Persian, the ones from Iran, Iraq, the Saudi Peninsula, etc. And the Jews are all over. And you start getting to a period as we enter the beginning of the Middle Ages that ultimately will be called convivencia once you get to the 1300s, which is a time period when Jewish mystics and Christian mystics and Islamic mystics all are, they're in the 13, 14, 1500s, are all interacting with each other. And it's very beautiful. But what really start happening is we have these commentaries, what are called responses or tshuvot. So we have the Torah and we have the Tanakh, and then we have the Talmud built on that. But people have questions. How do we practice the law? How do we do this particular mitzvah? How should we do this? How should we do this? Can we do this? Can we not do that, etc.? And so we have the Gaons who are coming up with rulings, and we start to get commentators. And I've listed some of the big ones behind us. Often you'll see with a commentator that we call them with an acronym. So the first one we're going to look at for a moment, we call him Rashi. His name is Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchak. So the R from Rashi is for Rabbi, the SH for the Shin of Shlomo, the I for Yitzchak, Rashi. He lives in France in the 1040 to 1105. Rashi is this amazing, amazing commentator. Now, what do I mean by a commentator? Commentator is a rabbi who takes and starts tearing apart the words, the phrases of Torah or of Talmud, Tanakh, and starts tearing them apart to look at deeper and deeper meanings, often built on earlier commentaries, often built on what someone said in the Talmud or what's about that text or just the text itself. And these are just some of the great, great commentators. And every rabbi should be a commentator, period. I get asked a lot, if someone moves out of town, they say, Rabbi, how am I going to find the right temple? I'm leaving you, or I can't be at Ner Simcha. What can we do? And my answer is, look at what the rabbi has written. If he hasn't written anything, that says something too. But look at what he's written. Look at his commentaries on the Torah, not just what he's written about, his temple or about political situation, but look at his commentaries on the Torah portion. Look at his theology. That's really how you can know where a rabbi is. There are those rabbis who are really not writers. They speak very beautifully, but most of those guys have people who will be their scribes and who will write for them. As an example, Rabbi Isaac Luria had someone who was doing most of his scribing, most of his work. So take a look at those kind of things if you want to understand who a rabbi is. And most rabbis put their commentaries, if they've written them, which they should, we put our commentaries up on a website, or in a book. So I've written a book that's a biblical commentary. You can go buy it. It's called Sacred Relationships. It's a commentary we studied a number of weeks ago on the section of the Bible called Ketuvim on our temple website. There's lots of articles I've written that are biblical commentaries for the Jewish Journal, for the Jewish Forward, for our community. I do a weekly thing called Torah Talk, which is looking at the week's Torah portion or holiday. You can see where someone stands, where theologically where they stand. And as an example, my friend Rabbi Mordechai Finley, or my friend Rabbi David Barron, you could look at their work and it would have a different, we're all friends, but it has a different persona, a different kind of feel to it. And so you would know, well, I really like Rabbi Barron, or I really like this rabbi. Take a look and see, always look at someone's writings, because that's really what we should be doing. Rabbi means my teacher. So these great commentators, they did commentary on Torah. So as an example, this is Rashi's commentary. This entire book is only on the commentary on Bereshit, on the book of Genesis. That's how big this is, just to give you an idea. I don't know, is that a frame? Can you see it? Okay. So, Orlando, would you do me a favor? Would you pass me my glasses, please? The blue case right there. Just take everything out that's inside of it. Thank you. Or we could just throw the glasses. That works too. Thank you so much. So, as an example, if we look at what Rashi says, and this gives you an example of commentary. Remember that the very first week, we took apart the word Bereshit. The first word of the Torah means in the beginning, when it began, etc. And that it really isn't real Hebrew grammar. It's incorrect grammar and the hidden meaning behind it that teaches us how to manifest something in the world. Rashi says Bereshit, in the beginning, and he says, God need not have begun the Torah, but from this month shall be for you, because it is the first commandment which Israel was commanded. So what is the reason that it began in the book of Genesis? And so he goes on, and he spends 4 or 5 pages in the English translation on just the word Bereshit, in the beginning of God's creating. Okay, this is his commentary. As he says here, it says, Bereshit bara Elohim, in the beginning God's creating. This verse says nothing, Rashi says, but expound upon me. This be understood as the rabbis of blessed memory expounded upon him. For the Torah, which is called the beginning of his way, for Israel, who were called the first of his prophets, etc. So this entire book is just a commentary on Bereshit. It's a 5-volume set. He also commented on Talmud and everything else. An amazing, amazing commentator. In the Orthodox world, the joke is that when you read Torah, you should have one finger on the Torah that you're reading and one finger on Rashi's commentary, because it's that brilliant. It's just amazing. There's also a whole theory that much of Rashi was not written by him, but by other family members. There's a fabulous book called Rashi's Daughters. I don't know that I agree with it, but it's really a well-researched book and a really wonderful piece of work. So Rashi is one of these great commentators, again, living in the 11th century. The greatest commentator possibly was Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, also known as Maimonides, known as the Rambam. Rabbi was the R, the first M is for Moshe, then B for Ben, meaning son of, Maimon, the second Mem. The Rambam, Maimonides. This is an amazing man. He lives in Spain. He moves to Egypt. He lives from 1138 to 1204. He writes a number of works, commentary on the Talmud, commentary on the Tanakh. But he writes something called the Mishnah Torah. The Mishnah Torah is amazing, amazing. This is called Chilchot Shabbat. This is his on the laws regarding Shabbat. This is his commentary on that. Mishnah Torah, which means the second Torah, is an exposition on the 613 commandments found in the Torah. It's written in poetic style, and it's taking all of Torah, Tanakh, and Talmud, all of it, and it's making it into one text. And as Rambam says in his introduction to Mishnah Torah, if you know this, you don't need to learn anything else, because everything is included in this. It's a pretty arrogant statement, but it's true on a certain level. He can back it up. This was an amazing, amazing commentator. It said that he spent 8 hours a day doing Torah commentary, doing Jewish commentary. 8 hours a day, he was a physician, being a physician for the poor people, and 8 hours a day being the physician for the Sultan of Egypt. So notice he didn't sleep at all. And given the amount of work that he did, it's very possible that this is true. I did not go to medical school, but when I've spoken with many people who did go to medical school, some of his medical theories are still taught today in first-year med classes. This was an amazing philosopher, an amazing doctor, an amazing teacher. Many people will say that he's very rationalistic in his point of view. I actually disagree. I think he's more mystical, but it's an amazing piece of work. He also wrote this book called A Guide for the Perplexed, which is incredibly challenging material. It is very disconcerting, very uncomfortable for a lot of people who love Rambam, because it goes into areas he doesn't normally go, areas that deal with mysticism, areas that deal with other aspects of the universe. So, Maimonides, the Rambam. We say there was never a Moshe like Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our great teacher. There was never another Moses like Moses except for Moses, this Moses. An amazing, amazing teacher and commentator. Another one, Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman. This is from 1194 to 1270, so a little bit after the Rambam. I love, he's also called Nachmanides. I love him. This is some of his commentary from Breshit. Amazing commentator, real mystical and spiritual bent to his teachings. Fabulous, fabulous man. And one of the things he's most known for are the disputations, again from Spain. These are all Sephardic commentators, interestingly. The brilliance is coming from the Sephardic side of the world, much more so than the Ashkenazi. And Nachmanides, or Ramban, has a lot of courage. So the church, the Catholic Church, decides that they're going to demonstrate that Catholicism is a better religion than Judaism, and they're going to have a debate, a series of disputations. They're going to have 3 of them. And representing the Catholic Church will be a number of bishops, including one who had been a Jew and knew Talmud and was very knowledgeable. And the judges were going to be 3 bishops. So it's kind of already a loaded court. It's already a kangaroo. And Ramban, Nachmanides, took them on. And it says something that even according to the bishops, they did not say Judaism was better. They said it was a draw, that they were both equally good, effectively. So that tells you about what kind of mind this man has. There's an old joke that comes from the idea of Ramban, which is that supposedly not long ago in the United Nations, many of you may have heard this story, that the Israeli ambassador to the UN got up and he said, before I start my speech about Israel and Palestine and all of this, I'd like to tell a story that Moses was in Israel and in Canaan, and he was bathing. And he got out of the stream, and his clothes had been stolen by one of the local Palestinians, at which point the Palestinian ambassador jumps up and says, "We were not even there at that time." At which the Israeli says, "My point exactly, and now I will begin my talk." So the idea of thinking backwards, anticipating what your opponent will say. Nachmanides, the Ramban, was a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant debater. If you study the disputations, they are so beautiful, and his arguments are so brilliant. Again, he has more of a mystical and spiritual focus, as opposed to Rashi, who really doesn't. Rashi is really very didactic. Before we get to Tur, there's this wonderful teacher called Rabbi Barclay. We call him Rabbeinu, just like we call Moshe Rabbeinu. He's one of the few people ever called that. He lives from 1050 to 1120, again in Spain. And this is one of the volumes of his Torah commentary. There's 6 books this size. There is commentary about the Torah, about the 5 books. Now, what Rabbeinu Barclay does that is really very different than anyone else is he looks at this concept called Pardes. Get a pen. This concept called Pardes. It means orchard. It's the root of the word paradise, and it stands for 4 different things. Again, we're doing this acronym a lot. The Pei, the R, the D, the S. It stands for Pshat, Remez, Drash, and Sod. 4 different ways of looking at any piece of Torah, any verse. It's called Pardes, the orchard or the garden. It goes back to Talmud. And it's not that one is better than the other. Okay, please don't make that mistake. They are all four equally important. They're just different ways of looking at it. So Peshat means the simple understanding of what the verse says. Remez, a little deeper about it. Drash, a story about it. Sod, the secret underneath it. So as an example, the rabbi picks up a bottle of water and drinks some. That's the Peshat level. The rabbi picked up the bottle of water and drank. The remez might be, the rabbi was thirsty, and his muscles, as a result, extended themselves to take the water and to drink some. So it's a little deeper understanding. It's not any more true, it's just a deeper understanding. Drash. The rabbi had been at a driving range where it had been sunny and hot and had not had any water while he was there watching his sons drive golf balls. And as a result, when he got home, he was thirsty. And he realized that only when he looked at a bottle of water, and therefore he picked it up and he drank it. And the whole story about it, the drash. Not more important than the simple level the rabbi picked up the water, just a different way of looking at it. And then Sod, the secret. The rabbi's body needed water because he had not been taking care of his body while he had been watching his sons doing whatever, and he recognized that his body needed that, and so his hand extended, his arm extended, his fingers closed around the bottle to bring it up and to drink the water and to be blessed with that blessing of water of drinking. I'm thirsty again. So that's called Pardes, four different ways of looking at it, at any verse. What Barclay does that is so beautiful is he looks at the verses, not verse by verse. He picks specific verses from each book, and he breaks them apart, looking at the Peshat level or the Remez level or the Drash level or the Sod level. So he may look at one verse from all four, or just from one or two, whatever it may be. It's a beautiful way of structuring his commentary on the Torah. As I said, he's one of the few rabbis we've ever called Rabbeinu, meaning our rabbi. We have two other guys who are extremely, extremely important commentators in the Middle Ages. The first is called the Tur, or Baal HaTurim. His name actually was Jacob ben Asher. He lives 1269 to 1343 in Spain. So remember, the Rambam in his Mishnah Torah elucidates how to practice each of the 613 mitzvot, okay, of the commandments. What the Tur does is he structures them into Arba'at Turim, which means four columns. Thematic columns, four columns on how to practice every one of these laws. It says to do this. Well, you can't do this because there's no temple anymore, so what do we do instead? And so he creates this structure that becomes how you live Jewishly. We don't have Sanhedrin to go to. We don't have the sages to go to. This is a structure that anyone can look at and say, okay, this is how we practice Judaism. This is how we practice this rabbinic Judaism we've been developing for the 1,000 years prior to this. He becomes known as the Tur because the name of his book, Arba'at Turim, Tur meaning column, Turim meaning columns, Arba'at, four columns. This is supplanted, and by the way, he's gotten a lot of, there's been resurgence in love of the Tur of Jacob ben Asher as of in the conservative Jewish movement, probably starting in the late 90s, 2000s. They started realizing it really is very brilliant. But the Judaism that most of us practice today, the Judaism that from which how do you do what you do? How do you do this law? How do you practice whatever? Comes from a man named Rabbi Joseph Karo, who writes a book called the Shulchan Aruch. Like the Tur, he splits it into these categories. Shulchan Aruch means set table, and it's a very specific book of law. That this is what you do, this is how you do it, this is when you do it, where you do it, etc. And he really catches on because although he's born in Spain, he ends up living in Sfat. Now, Sfat becomes this amazing area. We're going to study that in a week or two when we start getting into Kabbalah with Rabbi Isaac Luria of blessed memory and what happens in Sfat. But he's a rabbi in Sfat as well. And so this becomes the Judaism that we start to live by. We don't live biblical Judaism in 2020. It's just not what we do. We live rabbinic Judaism based on the Talmud, based on the Gonic teachings, but especially based on Rashi and Mishnah Torah. And then ultimately getting to the Shulchan Aruch, which really becomes the code of Jewish law. And it is accepted as the code of how you do what you do. Often people will never have even studied Talmud. They may not even know Talmud. They may not know any of the source material, but they'll say, well, Shulchan Aruch tells us. I think you better know where it comes from, because otherwise you're just preaching hollow words if you don't know the root of it, which Kara obviously did when he wrote it. But so I think the rabbis need to study all of this as opposed to just the law. But it is the law. It tells you how you do, what you do, where you do, when you do, how you do. Okay, and these are our commentators. Now we continue to have commentaries. Rabbis write commentaries. That's what they do, as I said at the beginning. So as we start getting into mystical commentaries, we'll get into Hasidic commentaries, we'll get into modern commentaries. We'll get into things like Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, who does the entire Talmud with commentary. We'll get into different texts with commentaries. A lot of the mystical texts were translated and had commentary written on them by a man named Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan of blessed memory. Rabbi Kaplan translated the Sefer Yetzirah and the Sefer Bahir and different texts. Again, Zohar will have commentary. And all these things become commentary built upon commentary, built upon commentary. It's good to know the sources. I think that's important personally. But we can also just look at the commentaries and see how do we do it today. Okay? So that's kind of where Judaism goes from the Gaonic period to through the Middle Ages and into what becomes the foundation of Judaism that we practice now in the 21st century. Okay? It's a nice practice to say, okay, you know what? I'm going to take this year and I'm going to study Ramban. I'm going to study Bachya. I'm going to study Rashi. And every week you read the Torah commentary that great sage wrote for that week. And then the next year or year after, whatever it is, read a different commentator. And that way you get a real feel of the different commentaries in Judaism. Judaism is not monolithic. That's one of the amazing things about it. We don't have a pope who says this is the way it has to be. Each of these commentaries have their validity. Each of them have their beauty. Each of them have challenges. The question is, which one of them sings to you? Out of all the ones on the table, the ones up there, the two that sing to me most are Nachmanides, Rabbi Nachman, and Bachya, which I think are amazing. But I also love all of them. But those two just sing to my soul a little bit. The way they're written, it makes me smile in my heart a little bit more. Find the ones you like and study. Okay. I want to spend the rest of tonight on something else that really starts happening in the Middle Ages. In the same way that this is happening in the Middle Ages, and we practice Judaism based on these texts and these commentators, these truly Gedolim, these great, great sages. Something else really develops a lot in the Middle Ages that is still affecting us today, and it's anti-Semitism. And we need to track for a few moments anti-Semitism. Understand where we are, how we got to where we are, how problematic it is, how sad it is, and what it's based on. And to understand that this challenge of anti-Semitism is not going to go away in the blink of an eye or because any political leader says so or any other reason. So let's go back 2,000 years. Okay. For those of you who are not sure, Jesus was a Jew. Okay, he's a Jew. He's a rabbi. Beyond that, now we start getting into the theology of whether you're a Christian or not, whether you believe he was the Savior, the Messiah or not. But we recognize he was a knowledgeable Jew, and this world develops around him after he dies. And the early Christians are actually Jews. They're still practicing Judaism, and they're getting a lot of, they're a subsect of Judaism. And they're getting a lot of heat from the mainstream establishment Jewish world. They say, we don't believe he was the Messiah. We don't believe he's the Son of God. And you're Meshuggah, you're crazy. Messiah, Meshuggah, who are you? And so these early Christians, these Jewish Christians, um, are getting a lot of heat. They're getting a lot of persecution from the Jewish world, from the mainstream Jewish world. With Saul, they get a tremendous, who actually never knew Jesus in the flesh. He starts to proselytize the gospel, meaning the good news. Now, the Gospels, and this I learned from an educator in the Episcopalian, she's an Episcopalian priest who educates Episcopalian priests. I learned this many years ago from Reverend Deborah Dunn, that the Gospels actually aren't written by the people that they're named after. So the Gospel of Luke is not written by Luke or Mark or Matthew. These are not written by these men. They're written in the name of these men anywhere from 70 to 200 years, depending on whom you ask, after Jesus was around. So it's kind of like, some of you have heard me tell stories about my friend and teacher, Rabbi Shlomo Schwartzy Schwartz. It's kind of like if you relayed those stories to your child, who related to their child, who related to their child, and then that kid wrote a book of Schwartzy about Rabbi Schwartz. So it's generations away from the actual source. Now, if we remember 70 to 100, 150 years, 200 years after Jesus, we have this persecution in the Jewish world against the early Christians. And a fair amount of the gospel is written as a polemic against the Jewish mainstream of the time. Clearly, some of it is not written by people who had any idea about Judaism. As an example, we know that we drink our wine and then we have our bread and we do our prayers. And yet, when you see in the gospel someone writing that they did bread and then they did wine, we know that that wasn't our practice. That's not our practice. Clearly, it's not written for someone knowledgeable in Judaism. By the way, one of the great scholars who I've brought to the temple before is a man named Zev Garber. He's written a number of books on the Jewish Jesus and things like that. But let's move past that, past the Gospels. In 382 of the Common Era, so the 4th century, late 4th century, the empire decides to ask this man named Jerome to write a translation of the Bible. And it's translated into Latin, and it becomes called the Vulgate. This is Jerome, who's now called Saint Jerome in the Catholic Church. Remember, there's only Catholicism until you have the Protestant Revolution. Up until that point, it's only Catholicism these days. And Jerome clearly does understand Hebrew. He's very clear about some of his how he translates things, but there's one place where he consciously mistranslates. It's really, really horrible. And what he does is, there's a scene where Moses comes down from Mount Sinai, and it says that the light, Quran, the light shone from his head, rays of light. And that word is Quran. Now remember, in the Torah, there's no vowels. So this word Quran, clearly the light's shining from it, the rays of light are shining from his head, having just been in the presence of God. Jerome in the Vulgate translates it wrong, and he does it on purpose. And the reason we know this is because in other places, he translates Quran correctly. But here instead, he translates the word Quran, and he reads it as if it says Keren, which means that Moses has horns on his head. So the Vulgate, which is becomes the official church Bible, says that Moses has horns. You may be familiar with the image of Moses having horns in Michelangelo's beautiful sculpture of him. It's got little horns coming out. And so the myth becomes that Jews have horns. Now, this goes really well with that theology because they've got Satan and they've got this is my pocket. They've got Satan and they've got Jesus, and so they've got horns. They're now, the Jews have horns. They're siding with Satan. Why do they need to put down the Jews even at that time? And the reason it has to do with psychology as much as it does spirituality. See, there's two issues. The smaller one is that the Torah, the traditional belief is the Torah is given by God. It's dictated by God to Moses on Sinai. Everything else is written by inspired men. That's a problem for them because clearly the Gospels are written by men. All the Christian scriptures are written by men. So they need to kind of invalidate that. That's the small problem. But the bigger problem is much deeper than that. On the one hand, you have this group of Jews and Jesus, or you have the Jewish people, and Jesus shows up and they believe he's the Messiah. He's the personification of God, and he walks in and they reject him. Well, then it would make sense, in theory, that if these people reject God, something bad would happen to them. And so the very existence of Jews to that person of the early church who is not comfortable really in their own faith, and they need to demand it from other people, they view those Jews as a threat to their own understanding of God, and that there's both their very existence, let alone when those Jews thrive, that's a real problem. Because how could you reject God and still thrive? Unless you're either in league with Satan, with the devil, or the whole belief in the church was wrong. And so they need to start persecuting the Jews. And it starts with this translation from the Vulgate. By the way, this was the official church translation of the Bible, I believe, into the 1970s. Okay, it's a long time. People grew up. They went to their Sunday school. They learned Jews have horns. It's a problem. It gets worse. In 1144 in Norwich, England, and then again, it happens again in 1255 in Lincoln. But in Norwich, there's a little boy named William, and William disappears. This is when Passover and Easter, sometimes they're right next to each other, or Easter's in the middle of Passover, Seder's right on Good Friday, things like that. And this boy, William, disappears in Norwich, England in 1144. And the local priest says he was kidnapped by local Jews because, as we know, they're aligned with Satan. They have horns. And when they make their Passover matzah, this priest says, they need the blood of a Christian child, of a church child, to make their matzah. It needs blood. So this boy who disappeared, God knows why he disappeared or how he disappeared. But his disappearance and his death are blamed on the local Jews. Again, it's repeated in 1255 in Lincoln with little Hugh, same story, and starts going throughout Europe, this story that Jews need Christian blood of children, or blood of Christian children, to make their matzah. They drink blood, which, if you know the Torah, as we studied, you can't have blood. You can't have any meat that has blood. When you kosher meat, you got to get all the blood out. That's why we soak it in salt, to make sure all the blood's gone. I mean, I can't even have steak tartare. Sure as heck can't be having blood in matzah. It didn't matter, because this became the story. And remember that in our tradition, you become a rabbi typically with a lot of study. You learn. But in other traditions, you don't need to learn necessarily to become a leader. You just need to be able to preach. And so many of these early priests, these middle-aged priests, may not even have actually read the text. They just bother telling the story they want to tell, and the people buy into it. And as a result, we have what becomes called the blood libel, where the story is that not only do we have horns, but we drink blood. We kill Christian children during Passover to make our matzah. Again, tying us to the devil, again, tying us to evil. It is horrific. It is horrible. It is so sad. And yet, even today, there are many, many millions of people who believe it. Many of us know, I certainly know people. I know men who were in the Army or the Marines or whatever armed forces who, after going through basic training with whomever, Bubba from Alabama, whatever it is, become friends, and this person from Alabama, from wherever it may be, says, "Come on, we're friends now. Can you show me your horns?" I know many people in our congregation not many, but a number of them, who have been asked, can I see your horns? And so now Judaism is tied to having horns, to drinking blood. Our existence is a threat to the Catholic belief. We're blamed for the death of Jesus, which is a physical impossibility. We could not have had court during Passover, or if it had been Sukkot, but we couldn't have been having court at that time. I'm not saying that there were or were not people like Caiaphas doing whatever they were doing, covertly, but the Jews could not have been responsible in any way for Jesus' death, and yet they are blamed for it. So we killed God, according to the anti-Semite. We have horns, according to the anti-Semite. We drink blood, according to the anti-Semite. Therefore, our very destruction is holy work. So this goes back to the idea of us having horns in 382, so over 1,700 years ago. Norwich, England, 1,000 years ago. These are deeply ingrained in people's unconscious, subconscious, and their psyche. Now we're going to combine that as we start getting more into the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. The Jew, one of our values is to make sure our children are better educated than we are. We teach Talmud, we teach Torah traditionally to our children. We teach how to think. The Jew can't own land in Europe. Until Napoleon, he's not allowed to own land. So what does the Jew become? He becomes the money changer. He becomes the merchant. Many different societies, the merchant of Venice, Shakespeare. And as a result of being the merchant who understands business, who understands different things, he's hated by the nobleman from whom he works, because that nobleman doesn't know if he's being cheated or not by the Jew. And he's hated by the peasant because he's collecting money. So he's hated on both sides, because they become tradesmen, artisans, go into the banking businesses, things like that. And again, that hatred is only extended. So we kill God, have horns, drink blood, are only concerned with money, and are hated by all people around us. This hatred manifests ultimately in the Holocaust. In 6.5 million of our brothers and sisters being killed for no reason other than they were Jewish. It was not for political gain, for monetary gain, for land gain. It's because they were Jewish. With a machine like only the Germans could have made, the machine of the concentration camps. Auschwitz, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Treblinka. These places that we will study later on. And there are many survivors who the real anger is at the Allies, because they saw the Allied planes going over the concentration camps to go bomb trains, and railways, and train tracks, but never bombed the crematorium. It's to save so many Jewish lives. After the Holocaust, which is the natural conclusion of all this anti-Semitism, I mean, why shouldn't every Jew be killed if the Jews kill Jesus, and if the Jews have horns, and if they drink blood, all of which obviously are lies, they're hated by everyone. Why not just kill them all? But after the Holocaust, a very, very strange thing happens in human history. The world realizes what the Germans did. They realized the Holocaust. They realized how the anti-Semitism came to that place. How the natural progression was to lead to that. And now they feel a little bit guilty, or at least they don't want people to know. It doesn't sound civilized to say, oh, it's okay, the Germans killed 6.5 million Jews. So for a brief period in time, from the late 1940s, starting in the late 1940s, anti-Semites are embarrassed to publicly be anti-Semites. So they keep their anti-Semitism in the closet. Now, we all know as human beings that you're not going to get rid of 1,700 years of inbred belief, hatred, and like anti-Semitism. You're not going to get rid of it in a week or a month or a generation. It's just not that easy. Unless Mashiach comes, God willing, when he comes. So it's subverted. as we get into the 50s and the 60s. And Israel's the underdog, right? Immediately Israel's attacked and they keep winning, thank God. They have the Six-Day War. They have the Yom Kippur War. They have the Suez War conflicts. By the time you start getting into the late 1970s and 80s, the world no longer is feeling quite as guilty about the Holocaust, number one. But they're still feeling, I don't want to say I hate Jews, right? That wouldn't be very modern. So what they now start to do is they start to say, Israel's a bully, we hate Israel. And anti-Semitism comes out not as anti-Judaism, but as anti-Israel. The Arab world hires a publicist, Arthur Anderson Company, I think it was out of New York. They realized that the only way they're going to win the publicity war is to create a victim, and so the Palestinian cause is created. Palestinians are not related to the ancient Philistines. Palestinians are just Jordanians who attacked and were thrown out of their own country, but there is no historical Palestine in that way at all. And Israel is the bully, the Palestinians are the poor victims. This starts becoming perpetuated. And so rather than anti-Semitism being brought out like Shylock or saying, oh, that Jew has horns, that Jew drinks blood, these are horrible people, now the anti-Semitism is coming out as anti-Israel. And by the time you get into the 1990s, no longer is it even starting to get out of being hidden as anti-Israel, and anti-Semitism starting to come out as anti-Semitism, as anti-Israel, and as anti-Jew. The trope starts to come out, the myths, the stories, the people like Louis Farrakhan, what he starts to say, the different things like that. By the time you get into the 2000s, people aren't even remembering the Holocaust. There's no guilt about it. And it should be no surprise to anyone that you can have people like Tlaib, who sits there and just recently says, Palestine should go all the way to the sea, which means no Israel. Or Omar, who is saying it's all about the Benjamins. Again, the idea that Jews are all about money, this kind of anti-Semitic myths. And the silence, the absolute silence from Congress censoring any of these horrible, horrible human beings who make that kind of comment. If one congressman got up and made a comment about any other minority, Congress would be all over them, censoring them and everything else. But when these anti-Semites talk about Jews, when they talk about Israel, they talk about Jews, they're quieted. They're quiet. I have personal sadness and anger, but under anger I know is always sadness. I'm saddest about Chuck Schumer, who all his life and his career said he would be the Shomer, the guardian of Israel, the guardian of the Jews. And when Ocasio-Cortez got into power, and her friends Tlaib and Omar, when they've made their repeated anti-Semitic comments, Schumer has tucked his tail between his legs, and he has remained incredibly silent, as has Schiff and Nadler. Jewish men, and Schumer, in his case, is an educated Jewish man. He knows better. So today, we are in this world where anti-Semitism is accepted. One of the pieces of the manifesto, which you can find online, if you can't find it, email events@nersimcha.org. We will get you a link. In the manifesto of BLM, Black Lives Matter, the organization, it calls for the destruction of Israel. The movement for Black Lives, the same thing. When the riots happened in June, the Shavuos riots, which were basically Kristallnacht all over again, my understanding is 75% of Jewish-owned businesses in the area were looted or vandalized in one way or another by BLM. When Melina Abdullah, the head of BLM Los Angeles, was asked, why are you rioting in this area, as opposed to where City Hall is or the federal building, Abdullah, who is a self-proclaimed disciple of Louis Farrakhan, who has called Jews termites who should be exterminated, her comment was, and I quote, I wanted the people there to feel pain. And people don't stand up because anti-Semitism it didn't disappear. We all grew up in a generation where it wasn't overt, it wasn't in our faces. That's a unique time period in the last 2,000 years, but it was always there. Now it has come back out. So to understand it and how it manifests today, I don't want to get into the politics of anti-Semitism in today's world, because I am equally as joyous that we have a direct flight from Tel Aviv to Dubai, and with Bahrain and with UAE. I understand hopefully soon other ones will come out as well with Israel. But to understand why politicians, why leaders can make the anti-Semitic comments they make today, and no one says anything, you need to understand that anti-Semitism has been ingrained in people's psyche for 1,700 years. It's not about Israel. It goes back to the Vulgate. It goes back to that we have horns according to the Vulgate. It goes back to the blood libel. It goes back to Shylock, to all those kind of myths. So in the same way that anti-Semitism started 1,700 years ago, then really 1,000 years ago, really kicked in an institutional way with blood libel, and it's still affecting us today, these commentators did the same. These commentators also were 1,000 years ago, and they're still affecting how we believe, how we act. I would rather focus my efforts, my energy, my study on Rashi or Rambam or Bachya or whomever than on the dark side of that. But we need to be aware of both, and they both come from the same basic period of time. So that's kind of what starts going on in the Middle Ages and how it still affects us today, both in the light of our commentators who are so beautiful and the darkness of anti-Semitism, which is still sadly so prevalent, more prevalent now than any time in my lifetime. We're going to go from here into a different place. We'll start next week. And that is a place of understanding what also comes out of this time period in the Middle Ages, which is Jewish mysticism. Again, with its roots 1,000 years beforehand, but really becoming codified, really becoming integrated with Rabbi Isaac Luria, Ahari, the lion, the holy Rabbi Isaac, and what Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism is. I am going to ask that you do me one favor for next week's class. Forget everything you think you know about mysticism. Let's start from scratch, because there's so much noise that's not reflective of what we are and who we are and what Jewish mystical techniques are. So, God willing, we'll start Jewish mysticism next week. If you have any questions, email events@nersimcha.org. They'll get it to me. We have services this Friday. Wednesday night at Stonehouse at 7:30. We are having our Talmud and Tobacco session. The Supreme Court has said we certainly can have it there. So they will be open for us. And we will going to be studying light, the light of Hanukkah, the light of where we use candles. So the mysticism and the power and depth of Hanukkah, which is an amazing holiday. It's much more than people think. It predates the Maccabees by 1,000 years, actually. We're going to go into Shabbat candles, into Hanukkah, into Havdalah candles, and even into Yartzeit candles, and how candles, light, flame, etc., is so important in our tradition and how it can be used to change our lives. So thank you for being good to me as always, and allowing me to say these things as hard as it is to be teaching in this way. And I look forward to studying together next week. Again, Friday we have Shabbat services, both streaming and live. We also have our services live at our sanctuary at 880 Hampshire Road in Westlake. And again, Wednesday night at 7:30 for Talmud and Tobacco about the power of light at Stonehouse. Again, thank you for being so kind, and I look forward to seeing you this week in some way. Thanks and shalom.